According to the syllabus, today I would discuss the knowledge economy and its future. But I have decided to promote an inversion in the sequence and to devote today's class to the discussion of general ideas. The general ideas about the aim, the goal, and the general ideas about the structures or regimes that animate the programmatic argument. And I do this in order to preserve more closely the connection central to the arguments of the course between institutional detail and general conception. Now, let me begin by recurring to a theme that I proposed in an earlier class. One of the points of departure of my argument, of this programmatic argument, is the rejection of a distinction that was central to classical liberal thought. That's the distinction between the impersonal or neutral right and the sectarian goods, which people pursue within the framework of a neutral order of right. I reject this distinction, and I claim that there is and can be no neutral order of right. No set of institutions, no system of rights can be neutral among conflicting interests and conflicting visions of the human good. Every framework of institutions and of rights tilts the scales of experience, encouraging some forms of experience and discouraging others. The claim of neutrality made by classical liberal thought in favor of a particular institutional framework is always adduced to produce the opposite result of the claim, that is, to entrench a particular system of right, a particular institutional order, and to insulate it to a greater or lesser extent against attack. Given that no order of right can be neutral, we must look for the more realistic or defensible counterpart to this indefensible idea. And I want to argue that although the classical liberal idea of neutrality is untenable, it has a kinship to another idea which is legitimate and defensible and even indispensable. And the other idea is that an order of right, a system of life, an institutional framework, can be more or less capacious. It can be open to a wide range of contradictory experience. And it can be more or less corrigible, revisable in the light of experience. So this contradictory and corrigible character, I want to say, is the legitimate counterpart to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. Now, remember the contrast that I drew between the right and the left. I propose to reinterpret what it means to be a progressive or a leftist by contrast to what it means to be a conservative or a rightist. And under the terms of the conception that I proposed to you early in the course, the conservatives, the right, are those who believe that it is natural for human life to be small, at least small for the great majority of people. Except in those extraordinary moments like war and the sacrificial devotions that it requires, in which ordinary people, ordinary men and women, can be lifted up out of this long littleness of life in return for the sacrifices that they must undertake. And there's only an elite of extraordinary agents, then, saints, heroes, leaders, who stand above this herd of belittled conformists. The left, on the other hand, the progressives, are those who believe that it is not natural for human life to be small, and that ordinary men and women can rise up together to a higher form of life, to a life of greater intensity, larger scope, and intensified capabilities, strengthened capabilities. They become greater, but they become greater together or not at all. So it's this shared empowerment, this shared enhancement of agency, which on that view is the distinctive goal of the left. And I used a formula to describe this contrast in stronger terms. I said, thinking now of the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, that their aim was not the humanization of society. Their aim was the divinization of humanity, the elevation of human life by which we increase our share in the divine attribute of transcendence, not in the divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. And then the second contrast between the right and left had to do then with the reorganization of society, with the structure of society. So on this view, the leftists or the progressives are those who pursue the professed interests and ideals beyond the boundaries of the established institutional arrangements. And the rightists, the conservatives, are those who on the whole remain within the framework of the established institutional arrangements. Now there is a connection, a dialectical connection between our disposition to cross the boundaries of the institutional framework and our willingness and ability to redefine our interests and identities. Our understanding of our interests and identities typically presupposes the established institutional arrangements. When we cross those boundaries, when we begin to tinker with the institutional form of society, we characteristically discover ambiguities, dualities in our interests and ideals that were previously hidden to us. And thus, the activity of institutional transformation in turn inspires the reconstruction of our understanding of our interests and ideals. Now, what I want to do in today's class is first to discuss this goal that I just stated formulaically, the goal of a shared empowerment and enhancement of agency, a coming into the possession of life by ordinary men and women to a greater extent, and to discuss it in relation to a series of more or less equivalent theoretical vocabularies, to develop the idea in several different ways. And then in the second part of my discussion today, to explore in greater detail the meaning of the other part of this contrast between right and left, which is the part that has to do with crossing the boundaries of the institutional framework. The vital element there is a theory of structures or of regimes, and essential to animate any programmatic argument. If we don't have a way of thinking about structure and structural change and structural alternatives, if we have no way of thinking how the institutional arrangements and the ideological representations associated with them are changed, we have no way of advancing in programmatic thought at all. Programmatic thought becomes blind. So these are the two crucial elements in the development of the ideas. Now, then, shared greatness, becoming bigger together, our joint participation in this enhancement of agency. Let me discuss it first by reference to a conception of how we come into the possession of life and become free. Since, after all, this idea that I've described as what ought to be the idea of the progressives is an idea of freedom. I call it deep freedom, as opposed to that contrast between shallow freedom and shallow equality, presupposing the established institutions that shapes the conventional ideological debate. How do we become free? What is the nature of this self-construction that allows us to come more fully into the possession of life? We can represent it in three different dimensions. One dimension is the relation of the self to other people, to other selves. To be free, we must connect with others. No one is free alone. Every form of connection, practical, passionate, cognitive, is the basis of our agency, of our experience of life. But at the same time, every connection threatens us with subjugation and loss of personal identity, with dispossession. So there's this paradox, there's this contradiction in this first set of requirements of self-possession. We can only be free connecting with others. Others are not just, as Sartre said, they were the hell. Others are also the bringers of our freedom, of our agency. But every particular connection places us in jeopardy. So to be free, then, this is the first definition of this deeper freedom, we must succeed in moderating this contradiction between our need to connect and our need to avoid the jeopardy of subjugation or loss of personal distinction in which every connection places us. Now we have an experience in personal love of how it is that we can connect becoming more rather than becoming less. An ability to reconcile ourselves with the other, to imagine the other without this loss of personal distinction and autonomy. But love is restricted to intimacy, to the what Weber called the pianissimo of personal life. And therefore we need a counterpart to it in life among strangers. The generic counterpart to love in life among strangers that assuages this contradiction that I've just described is cooperation among free and equal agents. But of course, every particular form of cooperation, social, economic, or political, is contested. And that's the subject of history. History is this struggle over the forms of cooperation. Now, these political projects in which we organize a form of cooperation succeed or fail in historical time. And as I said in an earlier class, we don't live in historical time, we live in biographical time. We don't get to choose our place in history. And so, to the extent that we have not managed to diminish this contradiction through an institutional reorganization of society, we must do it somehow through the way in which we conduct our lives and relate to other people. And this is the sense in which we can say that our ethical projects, our moral projects, have to make up for the failures, for the omissions of our political projects. Now consider a second dimension in which this contradictory character of the presuppositions of vitality, of agency, occurs. And this has to do with our relation to a particular social world. No one can be free alone in the wilderness, in the forest. We can be free only engaged in a particular world, assuming a role, a station in that world. But every engagement in a particular world threatens us to exact, as the price of this engagement, our surrender to that world. And so here there is a second contradiction. To be free, we must be able to engage without surrendering. We must be able to deny to the social world the last word and keep the last word for ourselves. Or to change the vocabulary, the metaphor, we must be able to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. To participate in such a way that in participating we continue to resist, to defy, to overcome. And that means that the arrangements of society must be organized to make that possible. To make it possible for us to resist, to experiment. They must be revisable. They must not present themselves to us as an alien fate. Otherwise, also, we cannot be free. And once again, you could say, this idea is a political idea. It's an idea about the organization of society. And to the extent that it fails to be realized, it puts on us a moral burden of how to produce an equivalent effect through our moral action, through the way in which we live. Now, the third dimension of this contradictory character of the presuppositions of our vitality, of our coming into the possession of life, has to do with the relation of the self to itself, rather than the relation of the self to others or to a social world. You could say that to be free, to come into the possession of life, we have to form a coherent way of being in the world, including what the Greeks called a character, which is the stabilized or rigidified form of a personality and its way of operating in the world. But we can't allow this character, this rigidified form of the self, to suck the life out of us, to become a substitute for the living, incomplete self. We have to preserve our ability to stand apart from the character and to be able, therefore, to disrupt it from within. So as we grow older, as a person grows older, a carapace of routine and silent compromise and resignation begins to form around him. And he begins to think that his situation in the world and society, the kind of life he's living, is the only life he will ever live. And this combination then of the rigidified self, the character, with the situation to which we're resigned, then becomes also the death of freedom. So to be free, we must somehow be able to deal with this third contradiction, to form a coherent way of being and to retain the power to disrupt it from within, to break out of the mummy, as it were, from the inside, in order to keep living and to die only once. So these conceptions then are one of the ways of deepening the initial idea of what it means to transcend, to be free, or to use simply the vocabulary of vitality to come into the possession of life. And in all of them, even in this third one, of course, there's a horizon of political or collective action. A society, a state can make it more or less easy or hard for people to reinvent themselves, providing them the opportunities, the resources for this self-reinvention. But if this collective effort fails, then there is still the horizon of moral action by which to do it. So then, on this definition, freedom, the enhancement of agency, is success in moderating these contradictions. It's not all or nothing. There's not an ideal freedom, but freedom consists in our ability to moderate the contradictory character of these three oppositions that I just described. Now, before I go on to the second way of talking about this, let me stop and ask whether someone would like to comment or ask a question or make an argument about this. Yes?
Well, I'm trying to understand the difference between the first two types of contradictions. They both, I think, are in the domain of the relation of self to others.
No, there's a difference. So the second one is not about a particular people, because the focus of the first contradiction is our relation to you, to he, to him, to her. It's interpersonal connection. Whereas the second contradiction has to do with our engagement in a social or cultural world, which is not just one or another person. And then the third, as I say, has to do with one's relation to oneself. And these are all contested and imperfect and full of contradiction. And so the idea of vitality or freedom here is not a supersession of contradictions, but is the way in which we deal with these contradictions and what happens to them on our watch, both politically and morally. Yes?
Well, sort of going off in a similar vein, it seems to me that the way to, the mechanism for the second dimension, the second contradiction about our surrender to that world, seems to happen when we're interacting with people, like with essentially the first contradiction, when we're interacting in interpersonal like relations, conversations with a lot of people. It seems that's what enables sort of our surrender to that world.
Well, they're all connected, of course, and they give occasions for one another, these contradictions. But I still don't think that they're the same. If we assume a role in society, for example, the question is, do we allow ourselves to be defined by that role? And to what extent do we deliver ourselves to that role? And this is a deep issue, both political and moral, of our relation to society. So whenever we have a transformative vision, and we look about for a role in which that transformative vision could be promoted, we don't find that role. Because after all, the social world is designed to reproduce itself. And so when there is a genuine transformation, a prophecy, a revolutionary idea, the role by which it is to be executed is never ready-made. So we find a world which is organized to do something else, namely to reproduce itself. And then we have to seize on an existing role which is inappropriate to this transformative task and use it incongruously, bend it to a role for which it was not designed, until retrospectively we can create the role that is suitable to it. Yes.
I know you mentioned before about biographical time and historical time. Can you remind us of the distinction between those two?
So again, St. Augustine said, every age is equidistant from eternity. So, and according to that view, we have the same opportunity at whatever point of history we were born. But the limitation of that idea is that our accidental placement in history is part of our fate. It's fateful. And political projects, like these political projects we're discussing in this course, are projects that do not succeed or fail in the span of a human lifetime. They extend over many lifetimes. So that's historical time. And we don't live in historical time. We live in biographical time. So we want things to happen in our own time, naturally. But history doesn't do us this favor of making things happen when we want them to happen. So there's this divergence between biographical and historical time, which has a whole series of consequences. And one of the consequences, the consequence that I just drew attention to, is the relation between politics and ethics. So politics is about historical time. And these projects, these large projects that succeed or fail, advance or are pushed back. But if they fail, what do we do in the meantime? So in an earlier moment in the argument of the course, I said, we are in a long revolutionary period of the history of humanity. The last 300 years, the world has been on fire. And this revolutionary program, I said, has a political part, carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, socialism, and it has a personalist part, carried mainly by Romanticism and the popular worldwide Romantic culture, with the message, the sublime message, that every man and woman can ascend to a higher form of life. And this program, this revolutionary program, remains the most powerful program in the world. Because it, as I said, it has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. In a sense, it continues to command the agenda. Now, however, it is also paradoxically weak as well as strong. It is weak because its adepts no longer know what its next steps should be on either its political side or its personalist side. And if we don't know what the next step should be, it begins to die. That is, the only way in which a project can be kept alive is by being reinvented all the time. And so this course is about the next steps on the political side. Now, then, going to the issue of historical time. I think, hopefully, that my life, your lives, have fallen in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And My interest is for the revolution to continue. So I want to believe that it's an interlude, that the revolution will continue, the fire will burn again. And then it becomes vital for me not to allow my ideas and actions to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. And so that's then the point of confrontation between historical time and biographical time. Or to use another metaphor, which I actually use in one of the writings that are assigned there. In War and Peace, the protagonist, Pierre, looks up at the sky and he sees Halley's Comet. And he understands that the passage of Halley's Comet through the sky, which happens every, 90 so many years, is a presage of the invasion of Russia by Napoleon. And the invasion of Russia by Napoleon will overturn everyone's life. People will be brought out of their ruts, their routines, and great things will happen. Great and terrible things will happen. So that's Halley's Comet. And Halley's Comet in history are the wars, the great conflicts, the revolutions. Well, what happens to us if our lives happen to have fallen in the intervals between the visits of the comet? So then we might say we would want one of the aims that we would have for the reconstruction of social institutions is to make the comet less necessary. That is, to create institutions that dispense with these exogenous shocks in some way, rendering the impulse to transformation internal. That's continuing this discussion about biographical and historical time. So, in other words, on the view that I've just stated, we have a personal interest in all of this. We have an interest in not needing to wait for the comet because there may not be time for us before the comet visits us the next time. So we have to take things into our own hands and form an equivalent to it. So this is the conception. Yes?
As we ascend together,
Yeah.
will we reach a state of no inequality, or will there just be less inequality? And if there's still inequality, what will determine people's ranks in society?
What will determine people's ranks? So,
In that,
so
go ahead.
I think so first of all, I don't believe that equality, rigid equality, was ever in the history of political thought a great objective. So the real aim in dispute was the dignity, our power relative to one another. And of course, a radical and entrenched inequality is unacceptable to that. But here's this paradoxical fact about the egalitarianism of late 20th century progressive thought, right? So, as in the Anglo-American theories of justice, the theories of distributed justice. So they combine an egalitarian profession of faith, like, say, the Rawlsian theory of justice, with institutional agnosticism or skepticism. Now, when you add up those two elements, the institutional agnosticism or skepticism and the egalitarian profession of faith, what do you get? What you get is a justification, I think a pseudo-philosophical justification of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So that then explains these theories of justice, what they're really doing. So they were the philosophical accompaniments, the philosophical halo of the social liberal, social democratic settlement of the second half of the 20th century. And that puts them in context. And so all this abstraction, the veil of ignorance, the choice of principles, all this conceptual machinery, it really has a very homely and tangible target. The target is to defend progressive taxation and redistributive social spending under this institutionally conservative system in which we don't reinvent production, we don't reinvent the state, and so forth. If you think structurally, as the theory of regimes that I want to come to later recommends, you don't think of the institutional arrangements as a kind of afterthought. In other words, first we form principles of justice, later we allocate to the social engineers the detailed ways of working it out. Because we develop our understanding of our ideals and our interests through institutional innovation. It's not an afterthought, it's the thing itself. And that leads to a completely different understanding of how to think about these things. Now, if this is what distinguished the liberals and socialists of the 19th century from these late 20th century progressives, because for them the central issue was this issue of power, of greatness, and the sharing in it. Now, their vision of the content of that was, to my mind, much too narrow. And it was formed on an aristocratic image of lordly self-possession. So the image of Herzen, of Tocqueville, of von Humboldt, of John Stuart Mill was formed on this aristocratic model of the lord, the little despot in his house, in his castle. And that's obviously not an adequate model today. We have to have a richer conception of the enhancement of agency. Thus the need, thus my search for a more general basis on which to explore the contradictions of self-possession.
Thank you.
Yes.
In this idea that the institutions are the place where principles can get developed, but would this not run contradictory to the idea that everybody rises together, because there are only so many few people in the institutions that will then get a chance to develop those principles?
What do you mean there are only so few people in the institutions? I don't understand that. You mean people who hold public office?
Right.
No, but that's not what I mean by institutions. By institutions, I mean all the arrangements of society in every sphere, in civil society, in the economy, in politics. So the institutional is, you seem to be designating by institutions some small subset of what I'm calling institutions. Yes.
I'm trying to wonder why, I guess I'm wondering if the question is how do we become free? We have these three contradictions, all self in relation to other. I'm curious why one of the contradictions is not self in relation to change or to transformation, and why, to me, that seems relevant in the question of we can't wait for the
You have to
common.
talk louder, please.
Oh. I'm curious why one of the contradictions in how do we become free isn't self in relation to change.
Self what?
In relation to change,
Uh-huh.
it strikes me that the human being often prefers comfort over change. And so if we've always relied on a comet
Of
to
course.
produce transformation,
I'm going to come to that in another vocabulary. So I think this is a profound question that you raise, but allow me to postpone the way in which I'll deal with it. I'll come to it in a little while. But this isn't, so the question is, to what extent the identity of the person, the freedom of the person, presupposes a whole rigidified set of social arrangements. That would be radicalizing the thought you propose. So, for example, take a scriptural caste system, which is not the actual caste system that existed in India, but the one, the canonical one, the imagined one. And in the scriptural caste system, the sense of identity and freedom of every person in society presupposes the preservation of the whole system. So any attack on the arrangements of caste is an attack on the freedom and security of the individual. Now, let's say that's one pole of a spectrum of forms of social life. The opposite pole would be the pole at which our sense of security, of identity, our safeguards are disentangled from the arrangements that rigidify social life. Now, where are we on the spectrum? I would say we're not on this other pole of total disentanglement. We're at some intermediate position. Because, so, for example, in early classical liberal thought, the idea was the whole classical system of contract and property was intrinsic to the definition of freedom. It was part of the scheme of ordered liberty, and that scheme presupposed this whole legal regime. Now I think the more common skeptical belief is that they're not part of the definition of freedom, but any attempt to replace them with something else is likely to undermine freedom. So that's a different idea. But the practical consequence is still to say that part of society remains rigidified, because there's no way of unrigidifying it without threatening our freedom. So this question that you raise is obviously a profound question that is mixed up with the discussion of the institutions, of the institutional arrangements. Now I want to come to a second vocabulary, because there's no one way of expounding this conception. There are many ways. There's an open list. So the second conception uses the Hegelian category of estrangement, which has to do with the forms of unhappiness, of discontent in society and in the so-called modern societies. So you know the basic pattern of the argument in Hegel's phenomenology of mind. Let me just recall it schematically and suggest why I believe it's so profoundly mistaken in fundamental ways. So Hegel imagines an initial stage, the stage of societies before history, savage societies, in which the individual is fully identified with the social world. And he experiences no contradiction with the arrangements of society. Then subjectivity emerges, and with subjectivity a series of forms of estrangement, in which there are contradictions within consciousness and with the arrangements, and these contradictions drive forward the transformation of social life. And then finally, at the end of the narrative, we develop the arrangements in which we can be at home. Spirit can be at home with full subjectivity, but without contradiction. Now, I think there has never been the first moment. There was never a moment in which human beings experience no contradiction with their social worlds. There will never be a moment in which the human spirit is fully at home or at rest. And the idea that there is some canonical passage from the first moment to the last moment, and that this passage coincides with the turning points in European history, also cannot be accepted, right? This canonizes one bridge to the moral and development of humanity. But nevertheless, Hegel has this notion, and this is the notion on which I now want to fix, of the forms of estrangement, of unhappiness in the history of civilization. And what are they? So the first is subjugation. So, for example, in Marx's theory of society and history, the fundamental explanation of the existence of class society is that class society is necessary as the basis for the coercive extraction of a surplus. And without the coercive extraction of a surplus, humanity will not advance. There will not be economic development. We will not be lifted up from infirmity and poverty. So the system of coordination must impose this coercion on us. There must be this class hierarchy, and the class hierarchy will then be the instrument for the coercive extraction of an economic surplus. So that's subjugation, is the first form of estrangement. And the institutionally conservative social democrats say that the way to end subjugation is manifested in equality, although inequality is not its heart, it's just one of its consequences. And they say, we'll deal with it by redistributing, by retrospective tax and transfer. But retrospective tax and transfer, of course, is always much less significant than any institutional initiative that changes the primary distribution of economic advantage and opportunity. So it's always much more important to reshape the initial distribution of advantage and opportunity than somehow to compensate for that distribution by a secondary distribution, which is the object of the social democrats, of the institutionally conservative social democrats, and the theories of justice and so forth. So we could phrase this in terms of an understanding of the following contradiction. The liberals and socialists in the 19th century believed that there was a set of institutions that would make us both free and rich. It was the road to prosperity, to economic growth, and at the same time, the road to the emancipation of humanity from entrenched social division and hierarchy. There was a pre-established harmony, a spontaneous convergence between the institutional conditions of our collective enrichment and the institutional conditions of our emancipation. Now, we can't believe that anymore. We don't believe that. We don't believe that there's one institutional formula which guarantees us both wealth and freedom. And we are therefore tempted to subscribe to the equally dogmatic inversion of this belief, namely that there's a tragic contradiction between the institutional presuppositions of our enrichment and the institutional presuppositions of our emancipation. What we have more reason to believe is that there is a possible area of overlap. That is, a set of institutional arrangements that have the attribute of promoting our enrichment, but also the attribute of promoting our emancipation from subjugation. And one of the characteristics of the institutions in this area of overlap is that they have the quality of encouraging experimentation. This quality that I described as allowing us to participate in them while resisting them. Now, a second form of estrangement in modern society is disunion, the other great target of classical social theory. So, the classical social theorists like Durkheim, Tönnies, put this question. The previous form of the division of labor was the juxtaposition of the similar. So that's what Durkheim called mechanical solidarity. Society is divided into parts. The parts mirror each other. Everyone is the same. Now with our advance, we have a high functional differentiation. Durkheim called it organic solidarity. But with the functional differentiation, the people having specialized roles and professions, comes the problem of disunion. How can there be cohesion or union among ourselves if there is this functional differentiation? Durkheim was not able to find a satisfactory solution to this. And the solution adopted by institutionally conservative social democracy, the de facto solution exhibited under European social democracy, which we discussed last week, is the orchestration of money transfers organized by the state against the background of a high level of ethnic, cultural, or religious homogeneity. So against that background, it seems that the money transfers suffice. But once the background is eroded by migratory flows, for example, or by a greater level of heterogeneity, of pluralism, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. And that's what happens now in the European social democracy. So you could ask, well, where then can social union come from? It has to come from the multiplication of forms of collective action. The way in which society becomes unified once it's differentiated is by people doing things together in education, in the provision of public services, in mandatory or voluntary military and social service and so forth. They have to come together in purpose-driven forms of collective action that take them outside the boundaries of family selfishness. They become united or more united dynamically in action by doing things together. Now there's a third form of estrangement, which unlike those other two forms of estrangement, is not an active topic in classic social theory, but is a very important theme. And I will call it the problem of coldness. So in these pre-modern societies, the characteristic formula of social life, repeated endlessly in every department of social experience, was the combination of an exchange between two people, power, So it's an unequal exchange. And then over this unequal exchange, there is cast a mantle, a halo of sentiment, of reciprocal allegiance, of attachments. So you could describe it formulaically as the sentimentalizing of unequal exchange. That's the characteristic form of social life. In relations between bosses and underlings, men and women, parents and children, and so forth. Everywhere in social life, the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. And then we have the so-called liberal societies that unpack the sentimentalization of unequal exchange and then allocate exchange to the market, power to the state or to politics, and sentiment to the family and to private life. And what happens when there is this decomposition of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange is that society, in becoming freer, also becomes colder. So Talleyrand said, "Those who did not live before the revolution do not know the sweetness of life." The sweetness of life is the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. And so now we have in this world of Robinson Crusoes who are accumulating things so as not to depend on people. The constructive principle of the English novel, for example. And that's a world in which the price of freedom is coldness. Or to recur to Schopenhauer's metaphor of the porcupines, right? The porcupines huddle together in the cold night in order to warm one another. Then they prick each other with their spines. Then they go further apart, and then they become cold again. So they move restlessly back and forth until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. So that's us. That's the middle distance of this relative coldness. This is not a theme discussed in classical European social theory, except obliquely through Weber's conception of charisma and Freud's conception of decathexis, for example. But it is a fundamental problem of this unhappiness, of the discontent of civilization. So from this there arises a task. The task is, how can we become free while remaining warm? And the classic answer to that question is, it's through some radiance, some radiation, some effusion of family life. That is a lesser form of love or domesticity. I don't think that's promising. And I think that there is another possible source of heat. The other possible source of heat is the imagination. Because we are also transfigured or energized by imaginative activity. And the question is, to what extent can the institutions of society, the political and economic institutions, become a tangible embodiment of the imagination? What does the imagination do? It distances itself from the phenomenon, and then it subsumes the phenomenon under a range of variations. And through this activity, we negate, use the Hegelian category of negation, we negate something, we deny it some of its necessity, but we're able to understand it by subsuming it under a range of possible transformations. And this activity of subsuming the actual under a range of possibles is a source of energy in our relations to one another and into society, which the life around us ceases to be just an alien fate, a brute fate. It is penetrated and vivified by the imagination. The sense of the second vocabulary that I'm using is that it directs our attention to the characteristic forms of unhappiness in modern society, estrangement. And it asks us what it would take to overcome these forms of unhappiness by quelling subjugation, achieving union, and combining freedom with warmth. And that's another way to develop this conception of becoming greater together, because this is a collective activity in the design of institutions. Yes? You had a question?
I do have a question.
You look quizzical. Yeah.
Yeah, imagination surprised me there at the end. I'm still trying to come to terms of how it can be a solution to coldness. Maybe I just don't understand what warmth and coldness is, but I just, think of how much imagination was exercised when I was working on my qualifying papers for my PhD. It was a very lonely time, just buried there in a room. A lot of imagination,
Yes.
though. Not much warmth, phenomenologically, as far as I can tell. Maybe you're thinking of something else, so if you can help me sort of like imagine what kind of imagination this is that is a surrogate for this,
So
I
I
don't know,
think,
reciprocal allegiance to a broader structure.
sure, so I think one way there are many ways of approaching this, but one way is by the contrast between the agent and the machine, right? So the machine is formulaic. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we embody in a formula or an algorithm. We then express the formula or the algorithm in the device, and that's a machine. The machine is a proxy for us doing what we've learned how to repeat. And then under the conventional forms of industry, the worker works as if he were one of his machines. He mirrors the formulaic moves of his machines in Adam Smith's pin factory or in Henry Ford's assembly line. In imagination, we break from these formulas and we're in constant recreation, renovation. So everything is then viewed as an introduction to a penumbra. Around everything there is a penumbra of transformative alternatives. And that activity of going from the present to the adjacent possible, to the possibles in this adjacent room, is what I'm saying is energizing. And that's the energizing activity in politics, in thought, in art. It's different from affect, the affect of love. It has a different character, but the warmth there is not the warmth of sweetness. It's the warmth of this energy, this high level of energy, if you like the physical metaphor of temperature. When I say, for example, a high energy democracy is a democracy with a higher temperature, a higher level of organized popular engagement. So it heightens the temperature, it accelerates the pace, it combines decisive action by the central government with radical devolution. That's an energized politics. So the energy is then the warmth. The warmth not in the sense of something akin to love, but in the sense of mobilization. Where instead of being asleep or half asleep, which is the normal situation of a human being, right? Of being somnambulant, life is passing us by, and thus we're dying by installments rather than dying only once. We wake up, we diminish the place of repetition in our lives, and we're fully awake. eyes open to experience. And there we come into the possession of the present moment, which is all that we ever have. That's what I mean. So I'm not looking in that idea for a counterpart to private affect and love. I'm looking for a source of energy so that, as I said, we can come into the possession of life in the only time in which we have it, which is right now. So all that a human being has is life right now, in the present moment. We don't have the past, we don't have the future, and our ability to seize on the present moment with attention, seeing and not staring, depends on this faculty of the imagination. That's the sense of this coldness. Now, would someone else like to make a comment about this? Because then let me propose now a third vocabulary in which to understand what I'm calling this experience of shared vitality and agency. And it's more specific. It's more specific to the problems that we encounter in a period in which, yes,
Sorry, I just had one question about the first tenet of the second vocabulary.
yes.
About love and how through some radiance or radiation of family life that you talked about, and I'm curious at our kind of modern expression of like families taking different forms. In some cases, you know, maybe this traditional notion of family
Yes.
not being as ubiquitous as we once thought. How do you see the quality of human beings to love or to cultivate family in the modern era being different or challenging our traditional notions of that?
So the family continues to be an anchor, a source of warmth in the conventional sense, in the historical sense. But I don't see how the quality, this quality, which is rooted in family life, can radiate out to society. I don't see how that can happen. And the more families become then unstable or take anomalous forms, the less likely that is to happen. So the question is, the energy has to come, the warmth, if you like, warmth as energy, has to come from another quarter. That's the basis of the proposal.
So I guess like learning from the Greeks, who have multiple words for love, you know, I just wonder about the enlargement of that principle into philia or, yeah.
Sure, but I think that the idea of the enhancement of agency is, after all, an idea that appeals to action. And there is fellowship in action. That is, we do things together, we imagine things together, we reconstruct things together, and that changes the quality of social life. But in any event, regardless of my solution to this problem, the more important thing is to recognize the problem as a distinct form of estrangement in modern life, not reducible to the other two, the conventional ones, which are subjugation and disunion. There's this one, which is a source of deep unhappiness in society. And the unhappiness, I think, has to be addressed through the ascent of the imagination. The imagination is our divine attribute. It has a kinship to transcendence. It's the road to transformation. And I want the institutions to be the visible, tangible embodiment of the imagination. So we were talking about Halley's Comet and the exogenous shocks. Well, the task of the imagination is to do the work of crisis without crisis. So, and so you see there how it can become a source of energy. Now, here's the third vocabulary in which to understand these things. Under institutionally conservative social democracy, the main focus has been the development of a haven for the individual, a set of safeguards, protections, and capability ensuring endowments. So to take something out of the market and out of the general short-term agenda of politics and develop this haven of vitally protected interests and safeguards. And this is a large part of the meaning of the conception of fundamental rights. So what do fundamental rights mean? Fundamental rights have a technical or methodological aspect. Say, you take something out of the agenda of short-term politics. You, for example, you entrench the rights in the Constitution. And so you make them, you protect them against revision by some ephemeral majority. You require supermajorities. You have rules of special protection. That's the instrumental or methodological aspect of the fundamental rights. But now what's the substantive aspect? Why do you do this? And you do this so that the individual can be in some way empowered. And I now recur to the example of the relation between the parent and the child. The parent says to the child, I love you. I love you unconditionally, independently of what you do or who you are. Now go out and raise a storm in the world. So the focus of institutionally conservative social democracy is the attempt to put a human face on the market order, on the economic construction of the conservatives by creating this haven. But this is like only half the story, because why do we do this? We do this so that around the individual there can be a storm of experiment and innovation. And he then can be unafraid and capable in the midst of this storm. And so this then is the idea of the haven and the storm. So I can go back to that comparison of large forms of social life. There's the scriptural caste system, in which the security, identity, and freedom of the individual presupposes the rigidification of the whole social space. And then the opposite of that would be a system in which we disentangle the safeguards and endowments of the individual from the way in which this space is defined. So we want the maximum of plasticity in the social arrangements, with the qualification that there will be some haven of protected endowments and safeguards. Now there is a presage to this in the liberalized form of social democracy. The presage to this is in the so-called flex security, widely used in Scandinavia and in the Netherlands. So the idea is that the protections of the individual worker are not dependent on the possession of a particular job. They're vested in him. They become universally portable, but they don't presuppose any particular position in the division of labor. And so you could say what the system that I'm calling of the haven and the storm is the radicalization or the generalization of that idea. As not simply an idea for the organization of the labor market, but an idea for everything. So that's what we want. We want the maximum plasticity qualified by this ability of the individual to have safeguards against private and public oppression, and endowment guaranteeing, capability assuring endowments that are taken out of the agenda of short-term politics and taken out of the market, so that market experimentation can be radicalized and so that political experimentation can be broadened. So it's paradoxical. We take something out of the agenda of short-term politics so that the agenda of short-term politics can be broadened, can be more ambitious. That's the idea. And it's an extension of something that we already have. But I'm imagining it's radicalization, it's systematic radicalization. So in sum then, what I am suggesting is that this idea of is that we approach this idea of the enhancement of agency, of becoming greater together from the standpoint of these multiple vocabularies, these multiple perspectives, because there are different ways of talking about the same thing. Now, I didn't want to end the class before coming to my second large theme. So, to light our way, we need two sets of ideas. We need ideas about the goal, the direction, and we need ideas about the structures or the regimes. A programmatic argument cannot dispense with a theory of regimes. It's blind without a theory of regimes. And the theory of regimes does not have a merely instrumental role. The theory of regimes is part of the way in which deals with the way in which we transform our understanding of our ideals and interests. We work out our conceptions of the ideals through the development of regimes. Now, there were three high points in the history of Western political thought in the formulation of the theory of regimes. Aristotle's theory of regimes, Montesquieu's theory of regimes, and then Marx's theory of regimes, which was the culminating form of the theory of regimes in classical European social theory. And all three of them had, among other things, in common the attempt to establish a kind of duality in the account of regimes. It was not just a set of institutions, it was also a form of consciousness. This is what Montesquieu called the principle of each regime. The moral basis that the regime demanded for its stability and development. Now I want to look to this third moment in the theory of regimes, the Marxist moment, and distinguish in it two parts: the precious core and the baggage then which compromised the meaning of this core. So what was the core? Now I'm not going to state in Marx vocabulary. I'm going to radicalize the central idea. The central idea is that the structures of social life, the institutional arrangements, and the ideological representations associated with them are made and imagined. They are our creation. And because we made them, because we are their creators, we, as Vico said already in the 18th century, we can understand them from within in a way in which we can't hope to understand natural phenomena. The atomic structure of an object we understand from without. But a structure, a regime, we can hope to understand in the way in which a creator understands his creation from within. And what is the nature of these artifacts? So, in one sense, the institutional regime, the regime, are a kind of frozen fighting. So, in history, there's endless practical and visionary strife. We fight with one another over the terms of our relations to one another. That's the substance of historical experience. And this fighting is temporarily interrupted and relatively contained. To the extent that it is temporarily interrupted or relatively contained, the structures result, the organized institutional form of social life. So what are these structures? They're a kind of frozen fighting. Now you can change the metaphor in the following way. We can say, it's like a game of musical chairs. The music are the conflicts in history. When the music stops, or to the extent that it stops, we sit down on the chairs. The chairs are the structures. But it's the same fundamental idea, that what is fundamental is this endless strife, which is only partially interrupted or relatively contained. It goes on always in the normal moments in some lesser form, but it can break out again. This was the revolutionary insight in Marx's theory of structure, which he called the modes of production. But this insight was surrounded, compromised, and to some extent eviscerated by a series of deterministic assumptions. And there were, above all, three of them. So first, the closed list idea. There is a closed list of regimes. There are the Marxist modes of production: slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. So history has a project for us. So we don't need to have a project because history has a project for us. The second illusion was the indivisibility thesis. Each of these regimes is an indivisible system. It stands or falls together. From this there follows a binary idea of politics. There's either the reformist management of one of these systems or the revolutionary substitution of one system for another. And the third idea is the historical laws idea. There are laws governing the foreordained succession of these systems in history. Now, all of those ideas are false. And not only are they false, but very few people believe in them. So they continue to use the vocabulary like capitalism and so forth, but they don't believe in the heroic premises of the theoretical system in which this vocabulary was anchored. And that's part of this confusion in which programmatic debate now takes place in the world. Because there's no credible way of thinking and talking about structural change and structural alternatives. So the contemporary social sciences rejected these deterministic illusions, but only to the extent that they rejected the initial revolutionary insight. They all, in different ways, normalize the representation of social life. They see it as the residue of many activities of interest balancing or compromise, a kind of quasi-Darwinian evolution that results in the triumph of what works best, of the best institutions and practices. That's the dominant spirit of contemporary social science is what in the history of philosophy we call right-wing Hegelianism. The real is rational. And we come after the fact and we explain its rationality and cast over the halo of rationalizing justification. We don't understand, we don't really understand it because we don't imagine it. To imagine it, we would have to see it, to subsume it under this range of transformations in the domain of the adjacent possible. Now let me do something which is really impossible, which is to sketch not a theory, but a kind of proto-theory of structure. It's compatible with a range of theories. I am passionately interested in this subject, and I've devoted much of my work to it, but it's not what I'm going to do now. I just want to describe the elementary intellectual space in which we could have today a usable theory of structure. So what are these structures? They are the presuppositions of our ordinary activities in social life. They are the institutional arrangements that shape our conflicts and our routines, especially with respect to the creation of the future within the present. Our conflicts over the uses of economic capital, political power, and cultural authority, by which we make the future within the present. So how do we know we've changed the structure? We know that we've changed the structure when these routines alter. So, for example, Keynesianism, practical Keynesianism, with the use of counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy to maintain economic stability, was a revolutionary reform. It gave the shape to the political business cycle. It untied the hands of the state from the gold standard. Kalecki, a Polish economist, has said the point of the gold standard was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of confidence. Practical Keynesianism is an example of a revolutionary reform. It altered the system in some way and changed these routines of conflict. In this case, what we call the business cycle or the political business cycle. So these regimes that exist in the world, the present form of the regulated mixed economy, are the fate of the contemporary societies. There's a very limited, as I said in the first class, there's a very limited repertoire of different ways of organizing different parts of social life that is now on offer in the world. And that repertoire is the fate of the contemporary societies. If we want to escape that fate or enlarge that fate, we have to change the repertoire. That's the subject of our arguments here in the course. Now, what are these structures like? In them, different parts of a structure reinforce one another. That's true. And they resist transformation. But they're not a system. They're not indivisible. This is one of the fundamental errors of the Marxist theory of structure. The characteristic form of structural change is piecemeal, or fragmentary. That's what you might call radical reform or revolutionary reform. You change the structure part by part. It can nevertheless become revolutionary over time if it persists in a certain direction. And how do these structures get made? Well, they get chosen from the materials made available by these sequences of ideological and institutional transformation. So You look around and you combine something you have with something you import from another society, like the Japanese did in the Meiji Restoration. And there is a kind of competition, because it is true that these regimes compete with one another by the functional advantages that they make possible, the forms of economic growth, the levels of military power that they sustain. But there is no one-to-one relation between a certain level of collective prosperity and power and any particular institutional framework. What is characteristically the case is that the same level of functional advantage can have alternative institutional bases. So you can base the same level of the development of, say, the knowledge economy, the insular knowledge economy, or of military power on different ways of organizing the economy and the state. There isn't this one-to-one relation that Marx imagined between the functional advantage and its institutional presuppositions. Now I come to another part of this proto-theory of structure, which is especially interesting to my mind. A structure in nature either exists or doesn't exist. But one of these institutional structures exists more or less. That is, it can entrench itself against revision, or it can make itself open to revision. And this is one of the most important variations in these structures. So, a form of economic and political life can be arranged, it can be composed to open itself to experimentation in the light of experience, to have this attribute of plasticity, or not. And so, the more it organizes its own revision, the more it splits the difference between being inside and being outside, or it allows people to engage in it, remaining outsiders, as I said before, one of the forms of our freedom. Now, this is a very important variation in the nature of institutional systems. Because go back to that idea that we no longer believe that there's a pre-established harmony between the institutional conditions of enrichment of economic growth and the institutional conditions of emancipation from social division and hierarchy. But there also may not be a tragic contradiction. There's an area of overlap. And one of the characteristics of the institutions that may lie in this area of overlap is that they have this attribute of, to a higher extent, of laying themselves open to challenge and change. And you can see why that would be intuitively the case. There's a huge economic advantage in a form of economic life that allows you not just to recombine factors of production, capital, technology, and labor, within an untransformed framework of the market, but to recombine experimentally the elements that go into the framework. That's the radicalization of the idea of the market. You're not just recombining the factors within the framework, you're recombining the elements that go into the making of the framework. And that's going to promote development and practical empowerment and enrichment. On the other hand, the institutions that sustain a system of entrenched social division and hierarchy, in order to be sustained, will require some protection against being constantly attacked. And what you're saying here is you want to unprotect them. You want to subject them to endless attack. And that's the road to the subversion of these systems of entrenched social division and hierarchy. So we have then an idea of structure that structure is fateful. It is our fate until we change it. But it's not a system. We can divide it into pieces. We can attack it part by part. We can proceed by combined and uneven development. And structures vary in the extent to which they resist transformation, and therefore, as well, in the extent to which they shape their own sequels. So take the idea of path dependency. Each regime helps determine its successor, its sequel. But now it turns out, under this idea that I've added to the proto-theory, that path dependency is not a constant, it's a variable. Because we can create structures that not only resist more transformation, but diminish their power to shape what will come after them by the same means. So this view of structures as being structures but not systems has a host of important practical consequences. So the first consequence is there's a role for programmatic thought. History doesn't have a project for us. Either we make a project for ourselves or we don't have a project. But history does not mete out a project for us. The second is, it's not true that we have to choose between reformism and revolution. The normal form of major change is radical reform. The idea of revolution is a fantastical limiting case. And now, as I said before, for the most part, an alibi for its opposite. So I say, real change would be revolution. Well, that's not possible. So what's left is to manage the existing system, to put a human face on it. That's the real rhetorical role of the idea of revolution today. And then this idea of variation in the power of path dependency and of resistance. So we want regimes which will help organize and provoke their own transformation. And therefore make it possible for us to engage in them without surrendering to them. One of the main forms of our freedom. So we need to develop some such theory of regimes. And without such a theory of regimes, as I said, programmatic thought is blind. So remember in the first class, I told that little story about the dilemma of thinking and arguing programmatically today. I said, I propose something that's close to what exists. You say, well, that's certainly feasible, but it's trivial. I propose something that's distant from what exists. You say, well, that's very interesting, but it's utopian. And so I said, almost anything that can be proposed today is likely to be dismissed as either trivial or utopian. And I said, that's a misunderstanding of the nature of programmatic thought and of transformative practice. It's not about blueprints, it's about sequences. It's not like architecture, it's like music. And that generates a false dilemma, which threatens then to paralyze the programmatic imagination. But that false dilemma, and this is where it comes back to this point in the argument, is greatly aggravated by the absence of a way of thinking and talking about structural change, a theory of regimes, the great object of social theory and political thought. if we don't have a way of thinking and talking about structural change and structural alternatives, we fall back on a fake criterion of political realism, which is that something is realistic to the extent that it approximates what already exists. That's not a theory of political realism. That's just an admission of intellectual defeat. We don't know how to talk about change, and so we say it's realistic if it's close to what exists, and if it's not realistic. So that then brings, it's strange, because this kind of discussion that I'm imagining has to be intensely practical. It has to be about these institutional details, like the different ways of organizing the state or the economy and so forth. But it also has to deal with all these philosophical generalities, these abstractions, because otherwise it's blind. Without the development of a conception of empowerment, of agency, and without a theory of regimes, we can't get off the ground. And so there has to be this dialectic between the very abstract and the very concrete to make this possible. Well, it's a very tall order, I think. And now you add to this the nature of the university, the culture of the university system with all of its orthodoxies, its forced marriages between method and subject matter. It seems almost impossible. But of course, politics should be the art of making the necessary possible. So somehow we have to do this. So what do you think? I've said what I wanted to say, essentially. Developing the idea of the direction and of the regimes, yes.
I appreciate what you said about the need to be intensely practical, and I feel myself getting a little bit trapped in imagining how exactly we bring this about. I especially appreciate your whole point about the need to create a regime that doesn't require crisis for change.
Yes.
Even the creation of that possibility is something that is hard for me to imagine without a crisis.
Yes.
So
Well,
in
before you go on, let me remind you of one other point made early in the course that is relevant to this subject. So remember I said that in most of my programmatic discussions, I would be focusing on the middle distance. So in other words, things that are neither very close nor very far away. Because that serves the purposes of conceptual clarification. And given the nature of this exercise here, that's what's most important, clarity. But it doesn't serve the practical purposes of politics and of prophecy. So in the practice of transformative politics and the political prophecy, we typically avoid the middle distance. And we combine what's very close to what exists with what's very far away. Because the middle distance, which is the level at which most of the time I'm operating here, is discussing changes that are too close to what exists to arouse enthusiasm, but too far away to seem feasible. So what we have to do in the discourse of political prophecy and of transformative practice is to combine the very practical, the very short term with the very long term. And that's why the discourse of transformative politics is at once practical and prophetic. So the method of the political prophet is to evoke a higher life, a distant future, but then to offer some immediate down payment on it, which is something right now. So I think there's an intellectual problem for all of you, for all of us, in dealing with this. So Any transformation can be described in a form that's closer or further. And what matters is the direction and the initial steps. So if I'm describing it in a certain way at this middle distance, you have to correct for that and imagine it then extended or brought closer to the immediate. Because it's the same discussion. Now go on.
Well, I guess building off what you said, and I appreciate what you said about the middle distance. I think you're totally right that that's missing in a lot of the conversation. I guess what I'm curious about is, or I guess what I'm asking for is for you to reflect on a tension that I'm feeling, which is that as someone who focuses a lot on the immediate, the short term, I think a lot about the crises that can create the opening that you say we want to move away from, and I'm wondering if we need like one last crisis to create this middle distance, or if that undermines.
Well, of
the
course, there's a
entire
paradox because I can say I propose arrangements, political arrangements or economic arrangements that would make change less dependent on crisis. But of course, there's a circularity because the introduction of those arrangements themselves depend on crisis. And there's no way of escaping from that. So what I hope is that the imagination can diminish the severity of that circularity, right? That we imagine so that we're less at the beck and call of these exogenous shocks. And we can, what I call the imagination doing the work of crisis. So, but this is also a very practical problem, right? It has to do with the problem of agency. So I imagine those leaders of the conventional labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, which is after all, the historical core constituency of the left parties in the North Atlantic world. And you imagine a debate in which on one side of the debate are the politicians and the union leaders who are saying, let's dig into this niche of ours in the present division of labor and defend it against all comers. So defend it against the groups closest in social space, the foreign workers, the temporary workers, the small business class, and buy a few more years through subsidies and forms of protection for the continuation of this industry. So we know it has no future, it's not going to come back, and then there's the principal agent problem. Because the leader says, I know this has no future, but my career will be over before it stops having a future. Huh? Again, division between biographical and historical time. So what's on the other side? The other side has to be the argument that this has no positive outcome. We have to convert this form of industry into another form. To do that, we have to treat the groups that we used to treat as our rivals, as in fact our allies. That's a profound transformation. And it leads to a view of agency which is directly the opposite of Marx's view. Marx's view was the more intense class conflict becomes and the broader its scope, the more perspicuous the objective content of the class interest is. You know what your objective interests are, and the price for being mistaken is political defeat. This is the opposite of that view. It's saying the impression that classes have objective interests is an illusion, resulting from a situation of relative stagnation. If the conflict increases, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the proximate alternatives? And who would I become and what would my interests be under each of these alternatives? So the discussion of alternatives then becomes inseparable from the discussion of the interests. So that's a completely different view of agency. And that once again turns on the content of the theory of regimes, which is the basis for all of this. But who is the audience for all of this? That's because this depends now on a combination of passionate political interests with philosophical and social theoretical ambitions, right? And they were combined. They were rife in the 19th century. But look at now. So it's going to be a very hard struggle. Well, with that, forgive me for this interval that I made, this inversion of the sequel, but I thought it was important. We'll continue next week. Yes, sir.
Some of us were curious about the final assignment. Can you give some thoughts on that? Maybe now or next class.
Can I what? I didn't understand.
On the final assignment, like what would be
The final paper in
Yeah,
the
the final
course will always be, I haven't formulated the exact word, but it will always be an invitation to address the argument of the course, some central aspect of it. Not the whole argument, but an aspect which you regard as particularly telling of the intentions of the whole. So it's not a research paper, it's a thought paper. It's an occasion for you to develop your own voice and your own position, and to struggle with what it means to think and to argue programmatically today. So you develop your position, you instantiate it in a particular society at a particular moment. There will be a minimum of 15 pages. So if you turn in a paper of less than 15 pages, I accept it, but it arouses an expectation